When Usher took the stand, the courtroom fell completely silent. No one expected what came next. His testimony sent shockwaves through everyone present. Usher revealed that years ago, Cassie had confided in him about the alleged abuse she suffered at the hands of Diddy. But that wasn't the most surprising part. He went on to say that powerful figures in the music industry had pressured him to stay silent, warning that speaking out could destroy his career. Now, as Cassie returns to the stand, visibly pregnant and unshakable, the trial is beginning to expose long-buried secrets that were never meant to come to light. Diddy, once seen as untouchable, appears to be losing control, and Usher's decision to back Cassie might be the turning point that brings it all crashing down. What exactly did Usher say that caused Diddy to erupt in court? And why were industry heavyweights so determined to keep him quiet? The truth is finally emerging, and it's far darker than anyone expected. Stay with us as we take you deeper into this explosive courtroom drama that could reshape the entire music industry. Tension hung heavy in the room, thick enough to make people fidget in their seats. Flashbulbs popped from the press pit. Reporters traded hushed speculations, and courtroom security scanned the crowd, bracing for any sudden disruption. It was only the second day of the trial, but already it had the entire entertainment world on edge. Seated at the defense table was Sean Diddy Combs, once hailed as an unstoppable force in the music industry. Now, his expression was stone cold, his jaw tight as he faced federal charges that included sex trafficking and racketeering. The stakes were enormous, not just legally, but for his legacy, his empire, and the music world at large. Then the courtroom doors swung open, drawing all eyes to the man stepping through them. Usher Raymond, the Grammy-winning R&B star and longtime associate of Diddy, entered with a composed, steady gait. His unexpected appearance immediately sent ripples of shock through the gallery. Up until now, his connection to the case had been kept quiet, fueling intense speculation. Would he defend Diddy, avoid the trial altogether, or choose to speak? Now there was no more guessing. Usher was taking the stand. As he sat down, the room leaned in, collectively holding its breath. The prosecutor, clearly aware of how sensitive this moment was, adjusted his posture and carefully began his questions. No one anticipated that Usher's testimony would so decisively shift the course of the trial. But within minutes, everything changed. His words sparked an eruption, one that sent Diddy into a visible, uncontrollable fury. For a brief moment, the courtroom plunged into chaos, and watching it all unfold was Cassie Ventura, the woman whose painful story had become the epicenter of a trial exposing the darkest corners of an empire once built on fame, wealth, and power. Cassie, once known as Diddy's girlfriend and a rising star under his label, had stayed quiet for most of their years together. But now, visibly pregnant and resolute, she had made the choice to speak out, no matter the cost. On the opening day of the trial, she took the stand and laid bare a disturbing account of the abuse she said she endured for years. Physical, emotional, and sexual. Beneath the surface of luxury and fame, she described a reality marked by fear and control. She spoke of being threatened, of feeling imprisoned inside Diddy's lavish estate, and of the emotional toll of staying silent because the price of telling the truth seemed too high. But everything changed the following day when Usher was called to testify. The courtroom buzzed with one pressing question. Why was Usher here, and who was he going to defend? As he began, his voice was measured but steady. He looked the prosecutor in the eye, then turned briefly to Diddy, whose face gave nothing away. Every word Usher spoke carried the weight of someone who had long navigated the unspoken codes of the industry. Protect the powerful. Stay loyal. and above all, stay silent. He began by explaining his long history with both Diddy and Cassie, making it clear that he wasn't just an outsider offering secondhand information, but someone who had been close enough to witness what others had missed or ignored. At first, Usher's testimony came across as measured, walking a fine line between staying loyal and being truthful. But as he continued, the mood in the courtroom began to change. He recounted late-night phone calls from Cassie, her voice trembling with fear, reaching out to him in moments of desperation when she felt completely alone. Usher admitted the internal struggle he faced, wanting to support her, yet fully aware that challenging Diddy could cost him everything he had built. Then came the turning point. Usher revealed that not long after one of those calls with Cassie, he was contacted by a major figure in the music industry. The message wasn't subtle: step back, or there would be consequences. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as Usher described the chilling clarity of that warning. It wasn't just advice, it was a veiled threat. He explained how the executive made it clear that if he stood by Cassie publicly, he'd not only sever ties with Diddy, but also risk being blacklisted from the industry altogether. Usher confessed that fear kept him quiet back then. He didn't feel good about it, but the idea of losing everything he'd worked for, his reputation, his career, was too overwhelming. When the prosecutor asked him why he had chosen to speak up now, Usher's answer was direct and emotional. "I couldn't live with the guilt anymore. I had to tell the truth." Diddy's reaction to Usher's testimony was instant and intense. His fists clenched against the table, his jaw locked tight, and he muttered something under his breath, audible only to those sitting closest. As Usher went on, recounting more moments when Cassie had reached out to him, the cracks in Diddy's usually controlled demeanor began to show. The tipping point came when Usher described a night Cassie arrived at his studio visibly shaken and bearing bruises on her arms. That was when Diddy lost control. He slammed his fist on the table, shouted something about betrayal, and stood up so fast his chair crashed to the floor behind him. Court officers rushed in as the judge demanded order, but Diddy kept yelling, his voice filled with rage and disbelief. It took several tense minutes to calm the room. His attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, trying to contain the damage, but the moment had already been captured. News outlets and social media lit up in real time, with updates and footage spreading like wildfire. The image of Diddy, flushed, furious, and visibly rattled, was replayed again and again, sparking a wave of speculation about the truth behind Cassie's accusations. Meanwhile, Usher stayed calm, seated in the witness chair. Still, the look in his eyes revealed a quiet weight. He understood the consequences of what he had just set in motion. For Diddy, for the music world, and for himself. As Usher stepped down from the witness stand, the room was gripped by a heavy silence, broken only by the quiet clicks of camera shutters trying to capture every second of the unfolding drama. Cassie sat quietly, her eyes following Usher. Her expression reflected a deep blend of emotions, relief that someone had finally backed her claims, and sorrow for everything it had taken to reach this moment. She hadn't expected Usher to testify, especially knowing how much he stood to lose. But now that he had, there was a sense of validation. Her voice was no longer alone. The prosecutor gave Usher a brief appreciative nod as he passed, while the judge, clearly rattled by the courtroom's emotional intensity, called a recess. It was a chance for everyone to regroup and absorb what had just happened. Outside, chaos erupted. Reporters rushed to file updates, their voices overlapping, as they tried to make sense of what this bombshell testimony could mean for Diddy's defense. Legal commentators began chiming in. Some argued that Usher's status and credibility could dramatically sway the jury. Others warned that the defense would almost certainly try to tear him down, painting him as bitter, opportunistic, or chasing headlines. Back inside the courthouse, Diddy's legal team huddled in the hallway, their expressions tense. They understood the magnitude of what had just happened. If they couldn't undermine Usher's testimony, the trajectory of the trial and Diddy's fate might be permanently altered. For Cassie, hearing Usher speak the truth brought a powerful wave of reassurance. She knew the fight was far from finished, but in that moment, she no longer felt isolated. Outside the courtroom, public opinion was shifting fast. Supporters of both Diddy and Usher found themselves split. Some condemned Usher for turning on a longtime friend, while others applauded him for finally stepping forward. Social media lit up with hashtags like #I stand with Cassie and #justice for Cassie. At the same time, a flood of conspiracy theories about the music industry's grip on silence and image control swept across online platforms. But inside the courtroom, those swirling narratives narrowed into something more focused, a quiet but fierce confrontation between truth and influence, fear and courage, suppression and voice. When the recess ended and everyone filed back to their seats, the judge wasted no time reasserting control, warning that no further disruptions would be tolerated. Diddy, now noticeably more restrained, fixed his gaze ahead. Usher, having returned to the gallery, sat with his hands slightly shaking, but his eyes firm. The trial was far from reaching its end, but the tone had shifted. What began as a celebrity legal battle was fast becoming something much deeper, a reckoning. As the judge signaled for the next witness, it was clear Usher's testimony had opened a door that couldn't easily be closed, and the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. The headlines dominated every major outlet, reading like the plot of a high-stakes legal drama. Usher Raymond, the platinum-selling artist celebrated for his soulful voice and magnetic presence, had just taken the stand in one of the most talked-about trials in recent memory. But it wasn't just the fact that he testified. It was what he revealed that sent shockwaves through the public. For years, Usher had been seen as one of Diddy's closest confidants, a regular presence within the polished world of Bad Boy Entertainment's inner circle. And yet, here he was in court, composed and resolute, exposing truths that had long been whispered behind closed doors, but never publicly acknowledged. As he spoke, his tone was calm but unwavering, drawing the room in. He described the first time Cassie reached out to him. It was late, well past midnight, when his phone lit up. On the other end, her voice was shaky, nearly inaudible, as if she feared someone else might be listening. She sounded overwhelmed, emotional, and desperate to be heard. As she poured her heart out, Usher struggled to take it all in. What she described was deeply disturbing, a life of isolation, control, and quiet suffering hidden behind the polished walls of Diddy's mansion. Usher paused briefly on the stand, taking a moment to steady himself before continuing. He admitted that, at first, he didn't want to believe what he was hearing. He chalked it up to a misunderstanding, maybe just the fallout of a heated argument between two people in a complicated relationship. But as Cassie kept talking, it became clear that this wasn't just a disagreement. What she described was something much more disturbing. She told him about nights when Diddy would come home furious, his temper sudden and terrifying. The entire energy in the house would shift the second he walked in, like a storm rolling in without warning. As Usher spoke, his voice dropped lower, his gaze drifting as he recalled her words. He told the court that Cassie had begged him not to repeat what she told him, terrified of what might happen if anyone found out, not just to her, but to him as well. Then, with visible hesitation, he recalled one night when she came to his studio. Her arms were marked with bruises, and there was a vacant look in her eyes. She told him she wanted to escape, but she didn't know how. When he asked her why she felt so trapped, her answer stayed with him to this day. "He owns everything," she had whispered. "He owns me." The courtroom remained completely still as Usher paused, clearly rattled. The prosecutor didn't rush him, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the full weight of his words to sink in before moving forward. "Mr. Raymond, did you try to help Miss Ventura after she confided in you?" Usher's expression tightened as he gave a firm nod. He explained that he had made several efforts to help Cassie break away from Diddy's control. He even offered her a place to stay, somewhere far removed from the spotlight and pressures of the music world, where she could feel safe and start over. But each time they began to make a plan, something would interrupt it. A sudden call, a vague, unsettling message, little things that reminded her and him that she was being watched. Then came the intimidation. Usher revealed that after trying to support Cassie, he was confronted by someone he described as a powerful industry executive. It happened during a public event, but the exchange was private. The man's tone was easygoing on the surface, but there was no mistaking the threat underneath. Usher spoke carefully, his words sharp with memory, as if the moment had never left him. The man had said, "You know how this business works. You don't want to end up on the wrong side. Diddy's done a lot for you. It's better not to get mixed up in things you don't fully understand." Usher took a moment, visibly wrestling with the memory. Then, locking eyes with the prosecutor, he spoke again. "I was scared," he admitted. "Scared of losing everything. My career, my relationships, everything I had worked so hard to build. I knew how powerful Diddy was, how connected he was, and I'd seen what happened to people who stood in his way." His hands trembled slightly as he went on, revealing that the pressure didn't stop, it only escalated. "People started distancing themselves from me," he said quietly. "Calls went unanswered. Invitations stopped coming. Suddenly projects I was lined up for just disappeared. It felt like I'd been blacklisted, and deep down I knew exactly why." The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but deliberate. "Mr. Raymond, are you saying you were threatened into silence?" Usher's eyes swept across the room, finally landing on Diddy. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Yes," he said, "I was threatened, told to stay quiet, told to forget everything she told me. But I couldn't do that. Not anymore." The courtroom was alive with hushed murmurs as Usher continued his testimony. Journalists scribbled furiously, trying to keep up with each revelation. Nearby, Cassie sat quietly beside her legal team, wiping away tears with a tissue. For years, her voice had been silenced, buried under layers of fear, control, and manipulation. But now, as Usher spoke openly, it felt like those suffocating walls were finally beginning to crumble. Outside the courtroom, reporters scrambled to deliver the breaking news, each headline more explosive than the last. "Usher breaks his silence, Diddy's secrets laid bare. Music industry intimidation revealed. Cassie's cry for help ignored by power players." But Usher wasn't finished. He went on to share what he had witnessed firsthand, moments behind the scenes that painted a deeper, more unsettling picture. He described being in the studio during sessions when Diddy's temper would ignite without warning, changing the entire mood in an instant. He spoke of extravagant parties that turned tense as soon as Diddy's energy shifted. If Diddy walked in looking anything less than pleased, the entire room would go quiet. People would lower their voices, glance nervously at one another, and wait for the storm to pass. Everyone around him, Usher said, had learned to read the signs and fall in line. "People were afraid of him," Usher said plainly. "No one dared to challenge him, especially if they wanted to keep working in this industry." The prosecutor leaned in, asking Usher to explain just how much control Diddy had over those around him. Usher didn't mince words. He ran everything, he said. It wasn't just Cassie. Everyone in his inner circle followed his lead. They knew the consequences if they didn't. If you pushed back, you were done. You'd get cut off, blacklisted. With every word, the tension in the courtroom intensified. Diddy sat stone-faced, eyes locked forward, never once glancing at Usher. His lawyers scribbled hurried notes, whispering among themselves, clearly aware of the damage being done. The judge had to tap his gavel more than once as soft murmurs rippled through the gallery. Still, Usher remained composed. His voice didn't waver, filled with the quiet strength of someone finally unburdening himself after years of silence. Then, as he reached the end of his account, the prosecutor asked one last question. "Mr. Raymond, why now? After all these years, why are you choosing to speak out?" Usher paused. His eyes welled slightly, emotion rising to the surface. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "I couldn't stay silent anymore. I couldn't keep acting like I didn't know. Cassie deserved better. She deserves justice." The courtroom sat in hushed stillness. Usher's final words settling over the room like a heavy curtain. The judge cleared his throat, then called for a short recess. As Usher stepped down from the witness stand, there was a visible shift in him, his posture lighter, as though he had finally laid down a weight he'd carried for far too long. Outside, the atmosphere was electric. Crowds gathered along the courthouse steps, news vans lined the streets, and reporters jostled for position, eager for statements and sound bites. On social media, reactions exploded. Hashtags like #UsherSpeaks and #Justice. For Cassie shot to the top of the global trending list within minutes. It was clear that the trial had moved beyond the personal. It was now a cultural flashpoint. What had begun as a case between two individuals had morphed into something far larger, a reckoning for an industry where power, fear, and silence had long gone unchallenged. As the recess ended and court resumed, the room felt charged. Every seat filled, every reporter at the ready, fingers hovering above keyboards to catch the next revelation. Cassie sat quietly at the plaintiff's table. Her eyes stayed on the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had shown strength throughout the ordeal, but something in her had shifted. There was relief, yes, but also an unmistakable awareness of what had just been unearthed. Usher's testimony hadn't just supported her claims. It had pulled back the curtain on a system built to protect the powerful. And in doing so, it had revealed a far more dangerous truth, one that had been buried for years beneath silence, fear, and the illusion of fame. As the judge brought the courtroom back to order, Diddy's defense team leaned in close, whispering urgently among themselves. The lead attorney, known for his skill in picking apart witness credibility, rose from his seat, adjusting his suit jacket with quiet precision. His face was unreadable, all cold focus as he approached the bench. He glanced briefly at Usher, now seated in the gallery, no longer on the stand, but still very much at the center of the storm. His testimony had stirred. When the defense began, the attorney's voice was calm, controlled, even reassuring. He started by reminding the court of the fundamental principle of presumed innocence. Every word was calculated, designed not to attack outright, but to subtly undermine. He spoke of Usher's fame, the pressures that came with his public image, and the nature of an industry built on competition and ego. He floated the idea, not as an accusation, but as a suggestion, that perhaps Usher's motives weren't as pure as they seemed, that maybe this was less about justice and more about rivalry or resentment. Turning to Cassie's claims, the attorney hinted that her accusations might be part of a coordinated attempt to take down a powerful figure, an orchestrated attack meant to damage, not to seek truth. The defense was shaping a narrative built on manipulation, not mistreatment, But the prosecution was ready. The prosecutor rose with quiet confidence, his voice cutting through the carefully spun implications. He reminded the court that Usher's words weren't just opinion. They echoed Cassie's testimony and would soon be supported by hard evidence. He spoke of fear, of the systems of control that silence victims long before they ever reach a courtroom. As he continued, his tone sharpened. He talked about complicity, the quiet bystanders, the enablers, the ones who saw but chose to stay silent. He made it clear that silence isn't neutrality, it's protection for the abuser. And in that context, Usher's decision to come forward wasn't just important, it was vital. Cassie observed the courtroom with a quiet, resolute expression. She had always known this confrontation was inevitable. From the very start, she'd been warned. Taking a stand against Diddy meant going up against a man with nearly limitless influence. His empire was sprawling, his network far-reaching, and few dared to challenge it. But she was here, holding her ground. Because by now it wasn't just about her, it was about everyone. Still silenced, still afraid, still caught in the grip of something they couldn't escape. The judge gave a nod and called for the next witness. A ripple moved through the courtroom as the side doors opened and a woman entered. Her appearance was polished, her presence composed and professional. Her name, Sarah Clean, a former assistant at Bad Boy Entertainment, Diddy's label. For nearly 10 years, she had worked closely with him, managing everything from high-profile events to day-to-day logistics. No one had expected her to testify. Her name hadn't appeared on any public witness list. As she took the stand, she glanced around the courtroom before locking eyes with the prosecutor. He approached her with a calm tone, asking her to state her name and describe her role during her tenure at Bad Boy. Her voice was steady and precise as she spoke, detailing her years in Diddy's inner circle. She described the relentless pace, the overwhelming expectations, and a workplace culture where loyalty wasn't just valued, it was demanded. The prosecutor leaned forward, his voice more direct now. He asked Clean whether, during her time working for Diddy, she had ever witnessed or heard about any misconduct involving Cassie. Clean hesitated. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Diddy, then back to the prosecutor. She drew in a deep breath, her hands tightening around the edge of the witness stand. "Yes," she said quietly. That single word dropped into the room like a stone, sending a ripple of tension through the air. The courtroom fell completely silent as all attention turned to her. Cleena began describing a night from 2017, one she clearly hadn't forgotten. It was during one of Diddy's infamous mansion parties, extravagant gatherings filled with celebrities, music executives, and hangers-on, all hoping to remain in his favor. Clean had been responsible for overseeing the evening's logistics, making sure everything from the catering to the guest experience went off without a hitch. She recalled the over-the-top displays, gourmet food laid out across long tables, drinks flowing nonstop, music booming through the estate, and an atmosphere soaked in opulence. But what stood out most in her memory wasn't the luxury. It was Cassie. Clean described seeing Cassie that night, away from the crowd, sitting alone by the pool with a drink loosely held in her hand. Her voice wavered slightly as she recalled walking over and asking Cassie if she needed anything. Cassie had looked up at her, eyes glazed over, and spoke in a hushed, almost broken tone. "I need to get out of here," she'd said. At the time, Clean admitted, she hadn't thought much of it. She assumed Cassie was just overwhelmed by the chaos of the party. But looking back, she realized it hadn't been a casual comment. It was a quiet plea for help. The prosecutor pressed on, asking whether Clean had ever personally seen evidence of abuse. Clean's eyes flicked nervously toward the gallery where Diddy sat, stone-faced and unreadable. She paused, then gave a small nod. There were times, she said carefully, when she'd show up at the office with bruises on her arms, sometimes on her neck. She always had an explanation, falling downstairs, bumping into furniture, but it happened too often to be just bad luck. Her voice quivered slightly, but she pressed on, pushing past the fear that had kept her quiet for years. Suddenly, the defense attorney jumped to his feet, objecting forcefully. His voice rang out across the courtroom, arguing that Clean's testimony was based on speculation, not fact, that she was drawing conclusions from things she couldn't possibly know for certain. But the judge quickly overruled the objection, signaling for Clean to continue. And once she did, the words came more freely, as if something inside her had finally been released. She described a workplace culture where questioning anything was discouraged. Staff were constantly reminded to keep their heads down, to value discretion above all else. She shared a moment when she once dared to express concern about Cassie's well-being to a superior. The response was immediate and chilling. "That's not your concern," she was told. "If you want to keep your job, leave it alone." The prosecutor gave the room a moment to absorb that before asking one final question. "Miss Clean, why are you choosing to speak out now?" She paused. Her eyes shimmered, but she held her composure. "Because it's the right thing to do," she answered, echoing Usher's earlier words. "I've stayed silent long enough. I'm done living in fear." The judge announced a brief recess, and the courtroom instantly buzzed with whispers. Journalists scrambled to capture every detail, pens scratching across notepads, fingers flying over keyboards. Outside, news outlets wasted no time. Breaking alerts flashed across screens, each headline more explosive than the last. Diddy sat frozen, his face unreadable, eyes locked straight ahead. He didn't move, didn't blink. His legal team crowded around him, whispering urgently, trying to strategize in the wake of testimony that had clearly turned the tide. But the shift in momentum was undeniable, and everyone in that room could feel it. Cassie leaned back in her seat, the tension in her shoulders finally easing, if only briefly. For the first time, it felt like she wasn't carrying this alone. The silence that had shielded Diddy for years was beginning to crack, and she was there to witness every piece of it start to fall. The courthouse was overflowing with reporters, cameras flashing in rapid bursts, microphones aimed in every direction to capture the unfolding drama. The atmosphere outside buzzed with energy, conversations filled with speculation, disbelief, and the growing sense that something monumental was happening. Clusters of people gathered along the courthouse steps, exchanging the latest updates in hushed voices, eyes darting toward the building as if waiting for the next twist. News vans packed the surrounding streets, satellite dishes perched above them like sentinels, ready to beam the next headline to millions of viewers around the world. Inside, the tension was unmistakable. Court officers moved swiftly, their expressions serious, anticipating another emotionally charged session. The judge returned to the bench, and with one sharp crack of the gavel, the room fell into silence. All eyes turned to Cassie. She sat at the center of it all, her back straight, her expression composed, but the gravity of the moment pressed heavily on her. This wasn't the image the world once knew, the rising pop star from Bad Boy Entertainment. Now she was the central witness in a case that threatened to bring down one of music's most powerful figures. The prosecutor rose from his seat, calm but authoritative, and approached her. He offered a small nod, a quiet gesture of encouragement, before turning to address the court. He opened by framing the purpose of Cassie's testimony, allegations of control, abuse, and psychological manipulation that had, over the past few days, shaken the industry. His delivery was steady and focused, laying the groundwork for what was to follow. Then, turning back to Cassie, his voice softened. He asked her not for rehearsed sound bites or curated memories, but for the truth, raw, unfiltered, and real. Cassie inhaled deeply. Her gaze moved slowly across the courtroom, pausing on familiar faces, lingering on others before finally returning to the prosecutor. She began her testimony slowly, her voice clear, but carrying the weight of buried emotion. Cassie described how she first met Diddy, how she was drawn into a world filled with wealth, power, and promises. It was a place that seemed like the realization of every dream, but it soon became something far more sinister. In the beginning, it all felt like a fairy tale. She talked about the glamorous parties, the late-night studio sessions, and the constant presence of celebrities and industry elites who drifted effortlessly in and out of Diddy's inner circle. It was dazzling, she admitted, like stepping into a fantasy she had never imagined would be real. But behind the glittering surface, something darker began to emerge. At first it was subtle, a comment, a look, a sudden shift in tone. Cassie described how Diddy's charm could flip in an instant, how laughter could dissolve into anger with no warning. His moods, she said, could shift like the weather, sudden and stormy. She recalled nights when the energy in the room would change without explanation, where a harmless word or a misunderstood glance could ignite a violent reaction. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, and her hands remained clenched tightly in her lap, as though holding on to her composure was the only way to make it through. The prosecutor remained focused, nodding gently now and then, silently urging her to keep going. Cassie's gaze drifted as she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. She was no longer just speaking to the prosecutor, she was speaking to the entire courtroom, and beyond that to anyone who had ever felt voiceless. She spoke about how Diddy's control wasn't limited to their private life. It stretched into every corner of her existence. He controlled where she went, who she interacted with, and even dictated how she looked and behaved in public. This wasn't just about jealousy or insecurity, it was about domination. He used to tell me, she said, her voice barely audible, that I was his, that I belonged to him. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The tension was so thick, it felt like no one dared to breathe. Even the judge, known for his firm demeanor, appeared affected, his expression softening as he watched her speak. Meanwhile, reporters filled pages with furious speed, knowing that each word Cassie shared was not just testimony, it was history in the making. Cassie went on, her voice steadier now, as if each word helped lift a burden she'd carried in silence for far too long. She spoke about the times she had tried to leave, packing her bags, ready to walk away, only to find herself trapped again, caught in a web of control and influence that felt impossible to escape. She described the isolation, how Diddy systematically cut her off from her friends, her family, anyone who might question his hold on her. It wasn't random, it was intentional. Slowly, her entire world had been reduced to a few spaces: his mansion, his studio, and the rules he imposed. And when she pushed back, there were always consequences. Her voice wavered as she recalled one particularly traumatic night. A disagreement, something small, had spiraled into violence. She was left alone, bruised and shaken, forced to tend to her injuries in silence. Her cries for help were swallowed by the thick walls of Diddy's estate, walls designed to keep secrets in and outsiders out. The prosecutor allowed a moment of silence, letting the weight of her testimony settle over the courtroom. Then gently, he asked whether she had ever sought help, whether she had confided in anyone during those years. Cassie gave a small nod, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I told Usher," she said softly. "He was the only person I felt I could trust." Her eyes shifted toward Usher, seated in the gallery. His face was filled with quiet anguish, but also a steady determination. Cassie spoke about their late-night conversations, the calls where she would pour out her fears, her hopelessness, her longing to escape, and how Usher, despite the risks, had tried to help her find a way out. But freedom, she said, was never within reach. Every time I tried, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, something would happen, a phone call, an unexpected visit, a subtle message that reminded me leaving wasn't an option. The prosecutor leaned forward, his tone calm but unwavering, and asked Cassie to clarify what she meant by reminders. She hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the gallery where Diddy sat surrounded by his legal team. His stare was fixed, cold and piercing, and the tension in his gaze seemed to hang in the air. Cassie quickly looked away, her fingers nervously tugging at the hem of her dress. Sometimes it was messages, she said quietly. Other times people would just show up, outside where I was staying. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. It was just to remind me they were watching. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she kept going. They told me that if I left, if I went public, I wouldn't just be ending his career, I'd be ending mine too. That no one would believe me, that I'd never work in this business again. The silence in the courtroom was almost suffocating, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The prosecutor took a step back, letting Cassie's words settle over the room. Then, turning to the judge, he requested a short recess to give the witness time to regroup. The judge gave a solemn nod, striking his gavel with a firm crack. Instantly, the room erupted into low murmurs and urgent whispers. Reporters scrambled to their phones and laptops, relaying every detail of Cassie's testimony, her revelations of control, fear, and intimidation, across airwaves and social media feeds. Outside the courthouse, crowds had grown. Protesters held signs high, demanding justice and accountability, their chants echoing through the streets. Public support for Cassie surged with every passing moment. Her story was no longer just one woman's private pain. It had become a spotlight on an industry long shielded by power, money, and silence. Inside, Diddy remained still, his expression unreadable. His legal team huddled close, speaking in hushed tones, weighing their next move. But the shift was undeniable. What had once been whispers, confined to late-night phone calls and silent glances, was now a national reckoning. The empire that had seemed untouchable was starting to tremble. As the courtroom emptied for recess, the prosecutor remained still, already thinking ahead to the next witness. The case was gaining momentum, and with every testimony, the carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. He understood that the next steps would be crucial, not just for Cassie, but for everyone whose voices had been buried beneath influence and fear. When court reconvened, the atmosphere was taut with anticipation. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Chairs scraped softly against the polished floor as people settled back into their seats. The judge's gavel came down hard, the sound echoing through the chamber and restoring order with a single strike. Reporters leaned in, notebooks open, fingers hovering above keyboards, cameras fixed on the witness stand. The prosecutor rose again, calm and composed, scanning his notes before looking up. When he announced the next witness, a ripple moved through the courtroom. It was Patricia Morris, a name unfamiliar to the public but well known behind closed doors. She had been the house manager at one of Diddy's private estates, someone who had quietly observed the inner workings of his world. Until now, she had remained out of sight. But that was about to change. The double doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Patricia Morris entered, the sharp click of her heels echoing against the polished floor. She was dressed in a simple professional outfit, her hair pulled neatly back. Her expression was serious, composed, but unmistakably resolute. Reporters shifted in their seats, sensing that what she had to say could change the course of the trial. For years, Patricia had operated in the background, away from the cameras, never part of the headlines, but always present. Her role as house manager meant she was a constant observer in Diddy's inner world. She saw the private moments no one else did, the ones that took place behind closed doors, beyond the reach of the public eye. The prosecutor began with the basics: name, position, length of employment. Patricia answered each question clearly, her voice steady and deliberate. She explained that she had worked at Diddy's estate for nearly 8 years, overseeing household operations, supervising staff, and organizing high-profile events. Her responsibilities gave her near unrestricted access to the property and the people who moved through it. Then the prosecutor leaned in slightly, his tone gentle but direct. "Ms. Morris, during your time working for Mr. Combs, did you ever witness anything that raised concern?" Patricia glanced briefly in Diddy's direction. He remained completely still, staring straight ahead. She hesitated for a heartbeat, just long enough to register the weight of the moment, then gave a small, firm nod. "Yes," she said quietly, "I did." The room grew still again, a tense silence settling over the courtroom as the prosecutor gently urged Patricia to continue. She paused, inhaling deeply as if bracing herself, then began to speak. Her voice was even, but each word carried the unmistakable weight of memory. She described the nights when Cassie stayed at the estate, how something always felt off. "She always seemed anxious," Patricia said quietly, her hands tightening slightly in her lap. "There were stretches when Cassie wouldn't leave her room for days, and when she finally did, she looked exhausted, drained, and visibly frightened." The prosecutor leaned forward, his tone calm but unwavering. "Ms. Morris, did you ever witness any acts of violence or intimidation?" Patricia's mouth tensed. For a brief moment, she seemed to choose her words carefully before speaking. "There were arguments," she said slowly, "loud ones. And sometimes things would be broken. Glass, furniture. Afterward, I was told to clean it up and not to ask questions." Her voice dropped, barely above a whisper. "One night I saw her running down the hallway. She was crying," Patricia said. "I tried to ask if she needed help, but a security guard stopped me, told me it wasn't my place." The courtroom remained completely still. The only sound was the hurried scratching of pens as reporters captured every word. Patricia gathered herself, her voice growing a little stronger as she went on. She described how Cassie would sometimes vanish for days, no one knowing where she was, only for her to return distant and hollow-eyed. One memory, in particular, stood out. Patricia recalled finding Cassie alone in the garden, sitting in the pouring rain. Her clothes were drenched, her knees drawn tightly to her chest. "I asked her if she wanted to come inside," Patricia said, her voice wavering. "She looked at me and said, 'I'm safer out here.'" The prosecutor's jaw tightened slightly as he gripped the edge of the lectern. "Ms. Morris, did you ever report any of this?" he asked. Patricia looked down at her hands, pausing before she answered. "I wanted to," she said quietly, "but I was scared. People who asked too many questions, they didn't last long." She raised her eyes to meet his, a flicker of helplessness showing through. "I needed that job. I had children to support. I couldn't afford to lose it." A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery, prompting the judge to call for order. The courtroom fell silent once more. The prosecutor straightened, his voice steady but firm. "Did you ever witness physical signs of abuse?" Patricia's face grew tense, her eyes glossy with restrained emotion. "Yes," she said after a moment. "Once." She described a night following one of Diddy's parties. While cleaning up, she caught a glimpse of Cassie. There were bruises on her arm and a faint mark on her cheek. "I asked if she was okay," Patricia said softly. "She didn't answer. She just shook her head and walked away." The gallery broke into murmurs, and the judge struck his gavel sharply, demanding order. Patricia stayed composed, but a subtle tremble had crept into her hands. The prosecutor allowed the tension to settle before speaking again. "Ms. Morris," he asked softly, "why are you choosing to come forward now?" Patricia took a breath, her eyes briefly meeting Cassie's across the courtroom. Cassie sat still, watching in silence. "Because I couldn't live with it anymore," Patricia said, her voice low but clear. "I couldn't keep pretending I didn't see what was happening. She deserves justice. They all do." Her words sent a quiet wave through the room, heavy with meaning. The prosecutor gave a solemn nod and thanked her for her courage. Patricia stepped down from the stand slowly, her posture upright, her expression pale but unwavering. As she passed Cassie, their eyes met in a brief but powerful exchange, an unspoken acknowledgement of pain, strength, and shared truth. Meanwhile, Diddy's defense team moved quickly, whispering among themselves, faces drawn with tension. Diddy remained frozen, his gaze locked forward, unreadable. His lead attorney rose and requested a short recess, citing the need to prepare for cross-examination. The judge paused, then granted the request with a firm strike of the gavel. Outside, the scene was electric. Protesters filled the sidewalks, waving handmade signs, their chants rising above the flurry of reporters and camera flashes. News anchors delivered live updates just steps from the courthouse doors. Their voices carried over the crowd. The revelations from the courtroom were everywhere. Headlines scrolled across screens, hashtags trended across platforms. Diddy's dark secrets exposed. Behind the mansion walls, witnesses break the silence. Cassie remained seated as the courtroom slowly emptied, her gaze fixed, distant, yet unwavering. The fortress that had long protected the powerful was beginning to collapse, one testimony at a time, one truth after another. For the first time in what felt like years, she sensed something shifting. The suffocating silence that had once surrounded her was starting to lift, and in its place, something unfamiliar and fragile began to take root: hope. At the prosecution table, the attorney stood quietly, eyes scanning the documents laid out before him. His focus was sharp, already locked on the next witness. The case was gaining traction, and he could feel it. Every testimony was another blow to the wall of silence that had shielded Diddy for so long. But he also understood the road ahead. There were still more truths to be told, more survivors to be heard, and more resistance to face. Then came the sharp strike of the gavel, calling the courtroom back to order. The quiet returned, heavy and expectant. The judge took his seat, and the atmosphere once again grew tense with anticipation. The prosecutor rose, purpose in every step, his face set with determination. The next chapter in this reckoning was about to begin. He stepped forward and called the next witness, his voice firm and composed. The name echoed through the courtroom, stirring a quiet wave of reaction from the gallery. David Thompson, the former head of security at Diddy's estate. The rear doors opened and David entered, his stance stiff, his eyes focused straight ahead, as he made his way to the stand. Tall and broad-shouldered, he carried himself with the calm discipline of someone used to control. Dressed in a dark, understated suit, he brought with him an air of quiet authority, though the tension around him was unmistakable. He took his seat, gave his oath, and rested his hands on the wooden surface before him, his composure unwavering. The prosecutor began with routine questions: name, position, duration of employment. David responded evenly, his tone measured. He explained that he had served as the head of security at Diddy's estate for close to 6 years. His official responsibilities included supervising the security team, maintaining the surveillance systems, and ensuring the property was safe at all times. But as the questioning moved forward, it became increasingly clear that his role had gone far beyond traditional security work. The prosecutor leaned in slightly, his expression sharpening with focus as he asked the next question. Mr. Thompson, during your time overseeing security for Mr. Combs, did you witness anything that gave you cause for concern? David hesitated briefly, his eyes drifting toward Diddy, who sat still and unreadable. Then he turned back to the prosecutor, his voice steady. Yes, he said, I did. The courtroom fell silent once more, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The prosecutor gave a small nod, urging him to elaborate. David took a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the edge of the witness stand. He began outlining the specific security protocols that had been implemented for Cassie, procedures that, he noted, were noticeably more restrictive than those used for any other guest or even close associates within Diddy's circle. He described mandatory nightly check-ins, limitations on where she could go, and the constant surveillance of her activities. There were cameras installed in every hallway, he said. Her phone calls were recorded and reviewed. Anyone who visited her was logged, and she was never allowed to leave the property without someone knowing exactly where she was going and when she'd be back. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, his tone curious but pointed. Were these security measures standard for other guests? He asked. David shook his head without hesitation. No, he said firmly. They were only for her. She was constantly under surveillance. If she left the property, someone was assigned to follow her. We were told it was for her safety, but it never felt like that. It felt like control. A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom, prompting the judge to strike his gavel sharply and call for order. David continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. He explained that staff were directed to report Cassie's movements directly to Diddy, no matter how minor. Even simple errands or scheduled appointments had to be tracked. Updates were sent through encrypted messages, coded texts sent to private devices, all with strict instructions to remain invisible, yet always nearby. There were times, David admitted, when I followed her myself. I was told to stay out of sight, but to make sure she returned, and she always did. The prosecutor paused, allowing the gravity of David's words to settle across the courtroom. Then he leaned in slightly, his voice low but direct. Mr. Thompson, did you ever witness any interactions between Mr. Combs and Ms. Ventura that gave you cause for concern? David glanced once more at Diddy before turning his attention back to the prosecutor. Yes, he said quietly, his hands gripping the edge of the witness stand a little tighter. There were arguments, frequent ones. Sometimes they were just shouting. Other times, it was more than that. The prosecutor's tone sharpened. More than that? Can you explain? David drew a steady breath, his face growing more tense. There were nights when I'd hear things, glass breaking, doors slamming, yelling, and afterward, she'd come out of the room, sometimes with visible bruises. Not every time, but often enough that it became hard to ignore. His voice softened, carrying a hint of something regretful. I thought about speaking up, but that wasn't my role. My job was to protect him, to protect the property. That's what I was hired and expected to do. The courtroom remained still, the weight of David's admission hanging in the air like dust settling in sunlight. The prosecutor stepped back slightly, his gaze locked on David. Mr. Thompson, he asked quietly, why are you choosing to speak out now? David lowered his eyes for a moment, his fingertips brushing the edge of the witness stand. Because I couldn't keep living with it, he said. I've seen too much. I've been part of too much. Staying silent. It's not something I can do anymore. A wave of murmurs rolled through the gallery, soft but immediate. Reporters scribbled furiously, while others tapped out updates on glowing phone screens, sending the testimony out into the world in real time. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was swelling. Chants grew louder, echoing down the street. Social media erupted with reactions, hashtags trending within minutes, the digital world igniting as David's words spread beyond the courtroom walls. The defense attorney stood calmly, his expression controlled and strategic. With deliberate steps, he approached the witness stand, his voice smooth and composed as he launched into cross-examination. He questioned David's motives, hinting at resentment or financial gain, trying to cast doubt on the reasons behind his testimony. He pressed hard, demanding specifics, dates, times, concrete evidence. But David didn't waver. He responded with clarity, recounting events with vivid precision, heated arguments, moments that left the staff uneasy, and repeated orders to follow Cassie, orders that, even at the time, had felt like something more than just security protocol. The defense attorney's tone sharpened, his questions coming faster, more aggressive. But David didn't flinch. He responded with steady confidence, describing the layers of surveillance, the encrypted messages, and the meticulous logs that recorded Cassie's every move across the estate. His recollections were strikingly detailed, precise, almost photographic. After nearly an hour of relentless questioning, the defense attorney finally stepped back, visibly frustrated, and returned to his seat. David rose from the stand, his posture straight, his steps measured as he walked back to the gallery. As he passed Cassie, he gave her a small, deliberate nod, a quiet show of support. Cassie met his gaze and returned the gesture, her expression softening briefly before she turned back to face the front of the courtroom. The sense in the room was undeniable. The cracks in Diddy's carefully controlled image were beginning to split wide open. The prosecutor stood silently, eyes focused, already preparing for the next voice to take the stand. The momentum had shifted, and he could feel it. Truth was beginning to break through the silence. With every witness, every word, the wall of power and protection that had surrounded Diddy for years was starting to fall, and more voices were waiting to be heard. The judge called for a short recess, his gavel striking the bench with a firm crack. Instantly, the room buzzed with whispers. Reporters rushed to file breaking updates. Phones lit up across the courtroom. Outside, the crowd had grown larger and louder, chanting in rhythm with the truth that was at last being brought to light.